But the problem's not with the institution itself, it's with whether the institution is actually, whether it's actually serving this single purpose of helping people to get in touch with the word of promise that God has spoken. Luther spoke very warmly about the Catholic confession, the practice of going to a priest and confessing your sins and being told that you're absolved. His only complaint was, as soon as you tell people they need it, as soon as you tell anyone they have to do that, now what you've done is put the church back as the mediator between God and man. Now what you've done is made the priest the one you go to get grace. But he says, if people don't think of it that way, then the confessional is very powerful, very useful. You go to the priest, you're unburdening your sins and concerns to a fellow human being who then speaks the gospel to you by telling you your sins are forgiven. That's the word of Jesus. That's the promise of Jesus. That's the gospel. So the confessional can either be a useful, good part of the church, if it's in service of the gospel, this word of promise, or the same confessional, Luther thinks, can be totally demonic if it is the thing that I'm going to receive the grace of God. If it makes all the difference in the world whether I don't know. I've used this as an example because it's an extremely subtle difference, right? In both cases, I might go to the confessional because I think that the priest has some kind of quantity of grace that he can give me to relieve me of the burden of my sin. And if I do that, Luther thinks I'm going to the Antichrist and I'm receiving damnation. But if I go in a different spirit, I just want to be, sometimes this life is such a burden. Sometimes I just want a human voice to speak in my ear. I just want a human face sometimes to tell me, Jesus forgives you. You're okay before God through Jesus. Sometimes I just want a human voice to tell me that. If I go to exactly the same priest, in exactly the same confessional, and he says exactly the same words to me, they can be words of life. Or exactly the same guy, exactly the same confessional, can be words of death. Do you see how subtle the difference is? I think this is important because Luther is not trying to come up with, here's the correct way of organising the church, you've got to get rid of these 9 things and have these 4 things and then we'll be doing it right. Here are the false doctrines, you've got to get rid of them, and here are the true doctrines, and once we've made those adjustments, now we're doing it right. That's not what Luther's trying to do. Luther's reform is partly about saying, look, the church can do lots of different things as long as they're not compulsory. As long as people know that the reason for those things being there is that they are opportunities to hear a word of promise and to respond not to the church, but to respond to God in faith. So, what does it mean to be a church of the Word? One of the funny things... Oh, thanks, that's nice. One of the funny things in Luther's observation is in one of his table talks, he says, there's nothing easier in the world than actually doing what Christ has told us to do. Preach the Word, proclaim the gospel, tell people the good news of Jesus. And however you're organising your church life, however you're organising communities, whatever sort of groups and institutions and structures you've got, put them all at the disposal of the gospel. Make them all instruments of communicating the promise of forgiveness and grace to people. And when the church does that, faith is able to grow, faith is able to flourish. Not because the church is mediating grace, not because the church makes faith possible. Whenever someone hears the word of promise, faith is possible because their heart can say yes. Their heart can say, okay. So Luther thinks, it seems ironic in a way that he thinks we sort of bend over backwards trying to do complicated things in the church when actually the fundamental thing we're called to do is so easy. What could be nicer than telling people the good news of Jesus? What could be nicer than finding opportunities to tell people that their sins do not separate them from the love of God.